All right. So my NTP-backed clock is saying it's 2:30, so I'm going to start with this talk. I have the honor to bridge the soup coma today, so thanks for being here. My talk is called AaaS, Anything as a Service, Anything Left to Do Then. And in preparation for the talk, the initial ideas I had were, well, basically, it's something like a holiday trip that I wanted to prepare for you. So we have like nice beaches, blue water, some ancient pyramids, cats, turtles as well, and a nice 3-course menu. So maybe even a nice cocktail somehow. So that's what I would like to start with. So let's go and jump right into. So just a quick words about myself. Dustin Huptas, my name. I'm working in the infrastructure section, if you will, working in system architecture, networking, security, and mostly currently trying to support my clients in actually finding a suitable provider model and a suitable provider at the same time. So back to the story. Before we get to the beach, it's actually a little more jungly out there. So welcome to the tech jungle. And tech jungle basically means in this respect that as a customer, before you get to the beach, aka before you get to this model that you're trying to implement, the infrastructure model, there's a jungle of endless possibilities that you're encountering, and you might stumble over various products and offerings from providers. And at the same time, the jungle is never quiet. So there's a lot of noise in the jungle too, especially in the tech jungle, there's a lot of noise. And I was wondering, is this noise being made to attract the unicorns, or is it coming from the unicorns? So maybe it's the mating call of a unicorn, and now we know. I don't know. So let them speak for themselves. There's things like, our platform is considered visionary in the Magic Quadrant. That's something you might hear when you're trying to look for a new platform. There's stuff like, we highly recommend our latest private cloud offering, and it's just going to be ready in 6 months' time. Or something like, you can easily lift and shift, that's the latest I heard, your workloads into our platform. So it sounds very, very easy, unless you start trying to do this. Or we bring production-ready containers to a country near you. That's also one of the latest offerings that's trying to be sold. My favorite, though, is this one. It's not completely empty. It's basically, please enter your credit card details. So that's also some kind of offering. Thinking about the jungle, if we look at the vendor space, vendors and providers, essentially they're trying to provide you with simplified answers to quite individual and complex challenges, I would say. And to maybe simplify this a little bit, I came up with 2 options that it looks you're somehow being given. The one is the symbol, you become the jungle. So it's thinking like the predator in this way. So you simplify your IT, you standardize whatever you have, and you trim yourself to fit into that vendor-prepared space. The other way around, let's call it start gardening. And it basically means that you create your own landscape and you try to fit those offerings, whichever way they might look like, to your individual needs. And you already might be asking yourself, so what's wrong? I was talking about this holiday trip that all of us wanted to take earlier, because essentially you just wanted to get to the beach, right? And that's what it looks like. That's the picture being painted during the sales pitches. It's all nice, clean, tidy, blue water, and you just imagine yourself lying there and actually do nothing going forward when you have bought into any of those vendor-prepared models. And I'm sorry to be thunder and paradise a little bit here, because that's how you envision yourself, right? You had hoped to get there rather sooner than later because you try to buy into a service model, and it's so relaxing to lie in the sun all the time. Actually, if we look at it, you might get to the beach, but it looks a little different, looks like that. So that's also a beach, but that's a turtle trying to get into the water, and let's face it, not everyone is going to make it, at least when it comes to them. I think 90% are not making it. And even worse, and by the way, the optimist would argue, yeah, well, I ended up at the beach, right? So everything's fine. So if we zoom out a little, it's even worse. So it's you trying to get into the water there, and yeah, you ended up at the beach, but you always have bystanders there in the top back, and those, yeah, I would say that's what I've found oftentimes. Those are the vendors watching as you're trying to figure out what to actually do with the products they provide you. And now what you need, what your demands are, that's pretty much the interesting question, I would say, which is the demands are not only derived from technical possibilities or things that might look interesting in a technical sense, but it's, let's put it like this, it has to fit your pockets. That's something your CFO would look at. It has to fit your waist. So this is the CEO business side part, I would say. So this has to be right too. And it has to fit your shoulders. So that's where I would put the technical weightlifting there. So you see where I'm coming from. All the technical people doing all the work, right? So that being said, as some just a little introduction to the whole talk, what I've prepared for you is I recently, started cooking a little more. So I prepared a menu for you. The starters would be, I call it the infrastructure pyramid. So we're trying to look at some nice sites there on our vacation trip. The second thing, which is more into cocktail department, if you think of ice cubes, I call it the adaptive IT cube. You could also say that's the molecular section of the course. And then we go over to the main course because the starters are quite abstract. You'll see in a minute to actually give you 3 examples of different companies and the questions and challenges they had to face when actually finding a new model. I call it 3 variations of delicious because different people, different taste. So you get an idea there. And of course, we end with a dessert because, sweet temptation, everyone likes that. Huh? So dessert, that's irresistible. So going into the abstract section now, basically, I guess everyone here in the room has some kind of understanding of the different models. I'm just trying to paint the bigger picture so you know how I think about this. And basically, if we start at the bottom of the infrastructure pyramid, there you have the physical infrastructure. This could be something that you buy as a managed hosting offering. This could be something that you run yourself. It could be the server room in the basement. It could be a real data center, depending on your needs. And moving up the chain with infrastructure as a service, you have public offerings from AWS, from Azure, also from Google, to name the big 3 here. But you could also run this yourself, for example, via OpenStack or VMware as another possible vendor. The list could go on and on. Those are just examples to show you how I think about those individual stacks. The next one up, that's something that has been discussed for recently more and more. And I also see providers trying to move into that space to provide models there. There's some like Heroku that is around for quite a while. I give you that. But there seems to be a shift to actually try to deploy this model at customers more and more so that you have a higher level of abstraction, if you will. The next section, function as a service, I heard a talk this morning on AWS Lambda and on going serverless and the experience that has been made there. This is definitely something that is coming up, but I would say that's something not behind the next corner, but behind the corner after that, I would say. And software as a service is just here for general reference, so it's a pyramid and it's not cut off at the top. I think that would have looked ugly, but not really something we're going to look into today. So target audience, maybe just to figure out who's actually working with those individual layers. So physical infrastructure, I would say this is the classical ops and infrastructure engineers that actually build this layer and make it functioning. On the infrastructure as a service layer, I know that DevOps is not a team, and I know that this is a culture model. Unfortunately, at quite a few customers, they started calling it their DevOps team. So I'm just putting this for reference. You could also say system developer. Maybe that's a name that fits a little better here. And moving up the chain, there you have platform as a service as the next level of abstraction again, which then changes also who is directly utilizing this layer. Going to function as a service, so I would argue that the primary audience for this, that directly interfaces with this infrastructure layer, would be the developers. And for software as a service, those would be business users, basically. What is interesting to note is that ownership and responsibility also changes when you look at those individual layers. Wherever you enter in that pyramid, the ownership is shifting as well. So because someone has to take care of the actual software that is being deployed and productively run on each of those layers. Maybe a couple of questions for the audience. Who's working with agile development teams? Okay, so I would say like 9/10, so almost all of you. And who's having the dev teams do the on-call? Yeah, that's brave people. Great. Okay, so moving into the function as a service space, as it's getting more interestingly recently, who's exclusively using a serverless architecture? Okay. So who's using it as part of their production system? I know at least 2, so that's quite a few already. Interesting. Okay. I just wanted to see what the actual adoption rate of those individual functionalities are across the room. Moving on, looking at the pyramid, maybe I just try to describe why to choose a specific model. Those are just ideas, and they're not meant in an exclusive fashion. If we start at the top, software as a service, basically you don't have an IT, or you don't want to have an IT for this specific purpose, or for everything what you do in terms of IT, and maybe you're not even here today. So this would be the software as a service layer, and I'm really not focusing on this one for the remainder of the talk. For function as a service, cost efficiency, because you can change the way you have to allocate compute resources up front would dramatically change. So cost efficiency would be something that you could be seeking there, of course, until a certain limit. And it somehow gives the impression of endless performance, if you will. Of course, that's not true, because data centers have certain limits. The platform as a service area, that's maybe you don't even want to or don't have an infrastructure team anymore. And you probably will still need to have some kind of operations team that actually is making sure, because not everyone raised their arms when I was asking for who's doing the on-call. I would argue that as long as not everyone raises their arms, you still have some kind of operations team that takes care of the on-call routine and understands the core parts of the system. Yet you can have a vendor that actually operates the platform for you. You don't have to do this yourself. For the infrastructure as a service layer, why would it make sense? Because you might need some high grade of individualization when putting together your platform. Plus, I call them heritage systems because I don't like the word legacy, because heritage is really, it's the stuff where the money comes from. So give it some respect, I would say. This oftentimes might make sense to actually have some kind of at least virtual machines-based infrastructure present that you can actually model to your needs. And with the physical infrastructure, as I put there, you're smarter than the market if you do the server stuff yourself. So yeah, either Google or Facebook. So you build your own data centers, you build your own hardware because you really know how to do it. And maybe, and that's the more the case that I encounter a lot more often, is you have higher security requirements than going, for example, with a public provider. Apart from that, if both are not true, then there is not too much leverage in there building your own physical infrastructure. just as a general idea here, now trying to map the different architecture models, if we go from left to right. This is also not meant in an exclusive fashion. It's just to give you an idea where you could actually deploy those individual models. And if we start with the monolith, I mean, of course, if you start at the top, you could build some kind of software that is that you try to upload as a zip file to a function as a service model that essentially runs in a container that has the size of a virtual machine that is running some kind of physical infrastructure. So I'm saying technically there's a lot more possible than what I'm displaying here. It's just if we go from left to right, you also, that's the essential point I'm trying to make, you're moving up the chain here too. So the pyramid itself, maybe I didn't introduce and explain that properly so far. There's a reason for it, why it's a pyramid. It's the x-axis would be the ability for you to change the infrastructure yourself. On the lowest level, we already had it. It's quite natural that you would be able to change basically anything. And moving up the chain, it becomes a lot less so. Already starting the infrastructure as a service layer, you will be able to decide what the size of your virtual machines are or what kind of GPU instance you use. But if your vendor does not supply GPU instances, you have to look for a different vendor. And moving up the pyramid also means on the y-axis you have the level of abstraction. And starting with the infrastructure layer, we have the introduction of APIs, which means you need to utilize APIs to actually make use of the resources that you bought into. Of course, I know there's web UIs, but if I look at the crappiness of, for example, the AWS web UI, for many years, I think that was not the focus for them, and totally makes sense to use the API. Yeah, speaking of increasing the level of abstraction, what you could encounter at some point, I would call it the cat in a tree problem. So you're up there in the tree, up there in the abstraction, and you don't know how to get down again. Because climbing up, of course, you need some muscle for that, brain muscle, obviously. And it's possible, it takes some pain, and we'll get to that later on in the talk. But climbing down is a lot harder to do because probably you will already have some kind of vendor lock-in effects that affect you in making it harder to get off the tree. Which might be in the architecture domain. Running microservices on bare metal, technically possible. Does it make sense? I don't know. Technology department, automating remote hands, so automating an engineer. The ticket system would be some kind of automation, but that's also weird. And in the organizational department also, I guess, people will say, well, I don't want to use the Ember display from the 80s anymore. So going back to older technologies, that's always hard. So from a company standpoint, it's very important to actively choose the architectural and also the technology/infrastructure models. So if we look at who would be doing that, who's actually taking care of that, there's at least 3 ways to look at the pyramid, right? If you start from the top, it's the developer. They want to create new things, change things, move forward, explore new possibilities. If we look at the bottom, there's the ops engineers, typically trying to keep the candles burning and hoping that not too many things change at the same time. And on the left-hand side, you would have the architects, where I would argue that those are the ones that have a more holistic view because they look at the whole stack from the side. So if you call them architects or not, you need someone that drives the decision which layers to choose and where to go with your current and or future setup. And this also goes beyond the pure IT functions, because essentially this is not the purpose by itself, but it's there to serve a purpose for the business side. So coming to the change in also how processes work. normally when you would buy into a vendor model, there is, at least it looks like you had some clear set of responsibilities. You buy managed servers with a certain SLA, and it looks like you have some very clear-cut contractual obligations. What I have found is that it's a little less so. It looks like that because you have a contract, but essentially to really make this work, you need the human interaction. I call this the yin-yang model, which means you give more than you would have in reference to the contract, and you receive more on the other end from the provider at the same time, because he brings in ideas and helps you maybe faster than he actually should or was obliged to do. And of course, to make this work, you need to find the right provider that's actually willing to not only look at the contracts, but to actually cooperate with you. But that's the advantage of this classic approach. Now, with the advent of APIs, this cooperation is moving, it's changing, because this cooperation is moving from the human to the technology layer, and it's really very much a clear-cut case. The clear-cut case that we had wanted to be with the contracts, now we have, technological contracts, if you will. And so the room of interpretation of those contracts is pretty much lost with the APIs. At the same time, this is the basis for the success of the insert your favorite as a service model there. And this basically means that the provider sticks to this set of rules that he published, and that you as a customer are only able to actually utilize those rules that the provider gives to you. So because you can't call anymore and say, well, I have an issue, can you help me with that? Let's discuss a couple of ideas. Nowadays, if you try to call one of the cloud providers, there's no one there. And there would only be someone there if you have a very, very premium service contract with them. So the cat in a tree thing, the good thing is you're not alone. There's other cats. I'm sorry for the picture, but just imagine to be multiple cats in the tree if you close your eyes now. So that's the idea. So, and if you look left and right, I'm pretty sure everyone is up some tree right now. And that's okay. But remembering the lock-in aspect I spoke about earlier, it's more about choosing the tree actively versus the tree choosing you. So I have this idea of some kind of structured approach to climbing the ladder. So you still get the tree, that's all fine, but there's a way to actually move along that tree. So, and that's the idea that I would like to share with you now. I call it the adaptive ID cube, and it basically has 3 dimensions. One dimension would be the architecture dimension. I'm not being very specific here for a reason, because things are changing. So the basic idea is that you're somewhere from fixed to flexible on the one hand. So, and everyone is somewhere there with their architecture nowadays. The other axis would be the technology or infrastructure dimension, which is somewhere from static to dynamic, whatever dynamic might mean. This might be along the lines of virtual machines moving into container-based systems, moving on to maybe even functions. So that's dynamic. And the third dimension would be your organization. It's also something to keep in mind. And this is from the very classical hierarchical moving up into a more agile fashion of cooperating, working together with each other. So the idea would be that you have some kind of cube here. So this is the moment where you can envision the cocktail part of the trip. So basically, you could use this cube and fill it with the state you're in currently, and think about how you could advance from your current state to the next state. With the core idea being that you try to move along those axes somehow equally and not try to only move on one of those axes. You cannot just implement container technology while you still have monoliths running. That's possible, but you would end up with giant images. So it's there's the question, what is sensible and what would make sense going forward? Maybe it's quite abstract, I get that. So one example would be this. So you have like a monolithic architecture and a physical infrastructure that you're running this stuff on, and you're quite happy, but now you're trying to move on. And you say, we're going all in on microservices and Kubernetes. So this would be really a stretch because you're trying to the right-hand side from the left-hand side without even taking the steps that are in between. So a little less difficult example would be you're already there with some kind of service-oriented architecture. You're already using infrastructure as a service. You have VMs, you have the automation in place. So your organization is also fit to actually supply this model, and people are thinking along those lines already. Now, moving on and taking the next step, that's something that is actually a lot more doable. I'm not saying that example 1 is impossible. I'm just saying that this is a lot more of a stretch for all the dimensions. So, if you're a fan of processes, you would have asked yourself, so where are my processes? So my take on processes is like, they're the sand in every organization, and the perfect state is when the sand feels like oil to your machinery. So I'm just trying to give you this picture to not see them as something bad, because they won't go away. They will always be there. And also imagine friction creates heat. So oftentimes friction is a good thing. So what could be examples? Those would be something like deployment processes, your classical service processes that you might have or might not have. And as soon as you have a vendor, you already have interfaces and processes that go along with the interaction with your provider. That you can't go without. And basically the idea is that the processes are the way the cube moves in space. So that's how you could imagine that. Okay, so that was the molecular starters, quite abstract, I know. If we look at the menu again, now going over to the main course, trying to dive into some more realistic examples. And I mean, but we have seen beaches, okay? So just to recap this one, I think we've seen turtles, okay, they were tiny, but they were there. We've seen cats, trees, there was a jungle, something like that. And you already had starters, so no one is starving along the way. I think that's good. So let's go and serve the main course. Before we go in there, a little disclaimer, the companies described are fictitious. So if any of those would feel real to you, to me, this would feel weird. Just saying that. Example number 1. I call it the Sure Inc. So that's the insurance company. Been around for a really, really long time. Founded back in the old paper days. They have like a backend system that's really still mainframe based. So they do have some kind of understanding of the current cloud computing model, by the way. It's just a little foggy. So if you compare mainframe and cloud computing, it's not too far away. It's centralized too. So, and they already have to buy spare parts on eBay. So but they're keeping their fingers crossed that the mainframe sticks around for some time to come. And back in the time, they heard something about this internet thingy, so they started building some front-end website for their customers, but they're really late to the game when it comes to the current models du jour, I would say. So they have old tools, old processes, but they have a new CEO coming in, and he wants to move to agile and be faster and beat the market. That's all he said, whatever that means. So they have essentially, if you look at the organization, it's a classical organization where you still have like technical project managers, you have project teams, and pretty much also difficulties in finding new hires because the new hire would have to speak COBOL and whatnot. So if we look at the different dimensions I just tried to create for you, if we look at the architecture dimension, there's the challenge that they have is they somehow have to implement a new model while keeping the previous one around. And questions that come up would be, do they replace the existing architecture, or will they rather add a new one? So they are running 2 architectures. What's the next step? What's a realistic time frame that they need to actually beat the market, so they are still at the market to beat it before they're out of the market? And do they need something like microservices for mobile apps? I don't know. That's questions. And ideas from the team would be, they could try out this new architecture on one of the new products that they have to build. And what's also important is that the architects, or whatever you name those people in your organization, and the operations people would cooperate on this greenfield approach, so they're actually able to supply a a really sufficient platform for the developers so that they're actually able to build out this new product. On the technological side, there is no automation there. It's all done by the guidebook, I would say. That's a good thing. They have documentation, really. They have a lot of documentation, but it's not automated. It's all human labor, if you will. And also, they have to ask themselves what kind of infrastructure model actually matches the organizational and also the architectural challenges that they're having. Ideas could be moved from physical servers to virtual machines. So at least you utilize your resources in a more efficient way, and you have an API so you can start doing the automation and finish this config management project you started 2 years ago, and you still haven't puppetized all those servers because you were too scared of the database servers. And so you just let that slide. Yeah, and maybe also talk to the developers to find the right level of abstraction. Again, this is a lot about communication because everyone is using and looking at the pyramid just from different perspectives. But it's the same pyramid. So in the organizational field, yeah, they want to go agile, but how? How do we do that? Yeah, what's the right approach for the existing team? They have worked like that for, I don't know, 10, 20, how many years? Some have golden watches already because they're around so long. And how can they meet those market demands that are there and only take one step at a time? Because it's an insurance company, after all, you should not forget about that. And yeah, they actively have to decide for a change path. Is it big bang? Just halt the whole company and work on changing architecture, technology, and organization at the same time, and then look at it after, I don't know, 5 to 6 years and figure out that the new remodeling project wasn't that successful, and I already have to start the second remodeling project because the other one didn't reach its goals. I'm not implying to take one or the other route, I'm just saying that's something to think about. Because change takes time. Yeah, in the process department, great job. They've done everything well because they have processes. They have perfect processes. And no matter what, they will continue to have processes down the path, no matter how you change the company, because it's just a matter of fact for the sector that they're working in. They just need to adapt those processes to the changes they make in the other areas. So that was example number 1, the insurance company. Example number 2, I call them disco discounts. So what they do, they're selling disco supplies. So like disco balls. So whenever they sell their giant XXL disco ball, there's like the company disco siren that goes off and plays some crazy 70s disco music, and everyone is really excited about that. Overall, they have quite a good grip on technology that they're having. Yeah, they have agile development teams. They're still using a classical operations approach because when they started out 8 years ago, there wasn't too much high fashion to actually go all DevOps. So that's why they still have their ops team around. And they feel they have to create a new containerized platform. That's very important because they feel they need to change and they need to be faster and they just need to be the greatest in technology. That's very important to some of them. So, same here. The monolith they're still having around from the old days is starting to really bugging them because they're somehow scared of changing anything there because it was written in C and this pointer thingy, no one is around anymore to actually figure that out. And of course, there was no documentation back then, and there's none today, but that's a different story. Should they get rid of the monolith or contain it, whatever that might mean, and put it in a freezer and not touch it anymore, put an API in front and do all the new functionality aside from the monolith, or start splitting it up, the hard job, because it's real hard concrete. So ideas would be, they could evaluate some kind of new pod structure. Okay, this is already hinting in a certain technical direction there, for a new vertical system that they're building beneath the existing one, to start learning how to actually move forward and maybe investigate the circuit breaker pattern, just an idea. I would argue that at this conference today and tomorrow, you're going to hear a lot more talks concerning architecture patterns moving forward that fit into that space a lot better than those mini ideas I have here. So that's why I just leave it as it is. In the technology department, the issue is they have this contract with their provider and it's running another 2.5 years. So there's no way that they could just switch to a new provider because they can't afford to actually just leave the old contract running. So they have to saturate and operate and set up the container stack themselves. They have to actually run it themselves. So the question they have to answer for themselves is how to deal with deploying and monitoring this rapidly growing number of services. Okay, I'm already implying here that as soon as they start doing that, the amount of services is rapidly growing. That's just my personal experience. Your mileage may vary, but I'm quite certain that, there's a certain chance there that you start doing that too. So what's the right platform to choose to actually, if you actually have to run it yourself? I thought that's a solved problem. The idea would be to choose a technology stack that has really a high automation level and at the same time some sane defaults, so you don't have to overly customize to just fit your use case. So it has to, the defaults have to fit your use case. And you could move on, maybe after 2.5 years. That's also something to consider, so you're not stuck with that provider and just prolongate that contract. In the organization department, there's also a couple of challenges. So the developers play with the fancy new technology. They're all happy. And on the other hand, the ops people, they really have to maintain this growing zoo of packages and software. So I already, had this pain myself. So that's why there's some color in this challenge. I give you that. So who will maintain an understanding of the overall system? Is this even still required going forward? We already had, discussed this topic earlier today, that maybe you don't need that anymore. One idea was to actually move development and operations closer together, to just increase the level of communication and also figure out ideas that would help the operations people that you could solve with developing software and not just with throwing tools or systems at it. And at the same time, change the responsibility that the operations department is having from just maintaining releases and taking care of those releases to creating and running a platform for you. Because essentially, as the number of artifacts are growing, you're somehow changing from releases to small deployments, if you will. And with the current process, they would still have a high reaction time in case stuff breaks. So, so the question would be how to design efficient and small processes for the handovers. They have to be smaller than the ones they have right now with all those releases and all the documentation that comes in. And who will be doing the on-call for the growing number of services? So, with great power comes great responsibility. I would argue an idea would be to increase the autonomy to the teams so they would be able to run the services themselves. But the responsibility also would be everyone all in on the on-call fun at the same time. Okay, you're looking very sad. That was just a joke. Of course, you don't want to do that, and no one will be doing that. So you're just trying to get to the beach, right? So one more example. We're already there. So third example, that's a small company, been around for a year. Let's call them the eyeball farmers. They're basically in the advertising business in the social media space, so they're trying to grab as much attention as possible. So they have quite some traffic spikes. And of course, they're developing in an agile way. And I say the ops team is missing in action, so I called it no ops. But there is like the word oops in there for a reason. So I don't know if anyone already seen that. So and the developers say, well, it's in the cloud, stupid. So what do I need operations for? Yeah, somehow the business people just figured out to make a really big deal with a large business customer. And that business customer somehow has concerns around data safety, security, this kind of boring stuff they didn't think about before. So somehow, they are really having the cat in a tree problem I was referring to earlier. But we'll get to that. So when we come to the architecture, we're at the microXchg conference, I would say, yeah, congratulations, done. I mean, it couldn't be any better. They're all in on microservices, right? Take it with a grain of salt, but let's just leave this aside. In the technology section, that's a lot more difficult, actually, because they're fully locked into the vendor stack they are having right now. So the challenge would be none of the local vendors or smaller vendors that they're supposed to be using or looking at provide anything besides getting VMs via an API. That's all, full stop. So they have to figure out which parts of their system do they have to re-engineer and which are the vendor services that they're currently using, because you never end with just spinning up a VM at a public cloud vendor. The magic happens when you start using all those additional services. And magic, I mean, that's twofold. Magic drawing you in more and at the same time giving you more possibilities. So it's really twofold, right? So they would have to find third-party products that maybe are able to replace those vendor services they're currently using, but this is going to be painful because this essentially also means that they have to run more of the stuff themselves. And they somehow have to figure out if they can find some tooling that is not tied to a vendor. So one example we've also heard today is, for example, Terraform. There's other tools, but just that you have an idea. So the organization, I mean, organization is great because it's only 1 year old and everyone is totally crazy, but they really have too few hands for all the issues to tackle. It's just way too much. And now some stuff like cross-cutting concerns like security and all this boring stuff is coming up, and I don't really know who's taking care of that. And yeah, 24/7 on-call is finally something this large business customer also wants to have. I mean, it was good enough to just sit in the office for 14 hours a day for 6 days a week. So that was almost like doing on-call, but the business customers are really happy with that. So they really have to figure out where to put their focus and what to do. And this means that's something very boring, non-technical, which is you have to figure out what are the roles that you want for your future IT organization as you grow. And also this means this more practical thing, but a lot harder to do, decide what not to do. So the processes. To them, the good part was there aren't any, so that's okay. That's what we call a greenfield approach, right? That also accounts for the process department. And unfortunately, now they need to have some for their data safety and compliance reasons. And this means they have to figure out what is a sensible set of processes they actually need to have, but not more than required, because falling off the horse on the other side also means you're not riding the horse. So that's not so easy. And a very basic, but yet I think very good idea would be to actually automate those processes that they have right from the start. Because then this means you can keep them out of the way, and they're there because they have to be there, but it's not that they're bugging you so much. So those were the 3 examples. And after the main course, if I look at the watch, we're coming to a close. There would be the dessert, which I called Sweet Temptation. But before that, let's go back into the jungle. So if we recap the examples, we basically had the discussion of the vendor login. We had the challenge of climbing up the ladder. So it might be difficult here and there, but it's possible. The challenge of climbing down the ladder, which is a lot harder to do. So you should really actively decide on where you want to be on that ladder. And also changing multiple dimensions at once, which is sensible and also necessary in some respects. So to answer the question, is there anything left to do for you when you buy into a service model? Yeah, of course. There's a lot left to do. I mean, okay, you're not out of the jungle, but at least you didn't starve, so that's good. And we found a clearing. So the point is that it might be different things that you have to do going forward, but still there's a lot left to do. And this means, one, look at your requirements first and not at those from someone else, especially not at unicorn requirements. Those are most likely not your requirements. Apart from the fact that maybe everyone wants to be like that, I don't know. Don't fall for simple answers. Yeah, it's easier said than done, actually. And you should examine more than just the technology dimension. That's what I try to give you as an idea with the cube model, so that you just basically you have more dimensions to reflect when you make your infrastructure decision. Try to evolve along all axes equally. This is never going to work in a perfect sense, but try to reflect the other axes. And actively decide what you buy and what you make, and don't let others decide for you. Thank you. Time for some Q&A.
So, thanks a lot. Are there any questions?
It's the soup coma. Oh yeah, this one.
Thanks for the talk. I thought it was really interesting that you said to move along all axes. I think it's always really hard to actually do more than more thing at the time. Mm-hmm. So what's your experience in that?
It's exactly as you say. It's hard, but it's doable. And I think the point is that it's a joint effort. It's not something that only one part of the company should be doing by itself. You should not just try to implement a new infrastructure in your ops team, or you should not try to implement a new architecture within your dev team. But you need to communicate and figure this out together. That's the basic point I'm trying to make.
Okay. More questions? Okay, so thanks again for the talk. And
thank you.
Yeah.